The sky was heavy, almost suffocating, as dark clouds advanced like a silent army across the hills. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a sound that echoed off the hard-packed earth of the small ranch. Samson stood frozen in his pen, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was more than just a horse, he was a shadow of something greater, a forgotten legend, but now with a scarred coat and a seemingly broken spirit. All that was left of him was silence. No one dared get too close. In the distance, the roar of an engine cut through the grim air. An old, battered pickup truck, covered in dust, slowly made its way up the driveway inside. James Harper, a 37-year-old man, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes were glued to the road ahead, but his mind was locked in the past. He hadn't set foot on this ranch in years, not since he'd lost everything, his army, his unit, what was left of his identity, but now he was back, and it was all because of this horse. It had started to rain hard as James stepped out of the truck. The heavy drops stained the hat he wore to hide his slightly graying hair. He walked slowly toward the corral, as if every step carried an invisible weight. There stood Samson, his former partner, the horse that had saved his life more times than he could count. But something in Samson's gaze struck James like a dagger in the chest. It was empty. As if the animal was no longer the same. Samson. James muttered under his breath, his eyes ablaze with emotion. He gripped the fence tightly and held out his hand, hoping for some kind of sign. But Samson didn't move. He took a few steps back, breathing whinny under his breath, as if the man before him were just a stranger. James felt a lump in his throat. He knew this meeting would be difficult, but he was not prepared for it. From a distance, Jenny, a young ranch hand, had been watching everything that was happening. She approached hesitantly. "He doesn't trust anyone," she said quietly, looking at James, "especially men. Something has happened to him." James turned to her, but did not answer. He knew exactly what had happened. He knew why Samson was there. He was lost, like a ghost, and he kept that reason to himself. Like an invisible scar, the rain grew harder as James stood there breathing hard. He turned to Samson and muttered more to himself than to the horse, "I can't let you down again." The rain was falling like a heavy blanket on the ranch, turning the ground to mud and the fences to dark lines against the stormy sky. James stood motionless, staring at Samson with a mixture of pain and determination. He wanted to believe the horse still recognized him, but the distant, wary look in the animal's eyes said otherwise. Part of him wondered if it was too late for both of them. Deep down, maybe this battle had been lost before it had even begun. James felt a tightening in his chest as old memories surfaced, pulling him back to a night much like this one, but elsewhere the stifling desert heat had muffled the screams and the silent sound of gunfire cutting through the air. Samson was there, his eyes were wild and his body was wet with sweat, but he stood firm. At James's side they had survived together through dangers that had seemed insurmountable, and now when bond felt torn like an invisible thread, a thread that had been torn apart by time and suffering. "You are not like this," James whispered as if Samson might understand, his voice shaking with a guilt he had never admitted out loud. "I have failed you and everyone else." He stepped back slightly, running a hand over his wet face, not knowing if it was rain or tears. Jenny, still watching from afar, took a step forward but stopped when she saw James's expression. It was the look of a man passed out, carrying a burden far heavier than he could bear. Samson made a soft sound, like a groan, that pierced James in a way words had never been able to express. He knew the horse was suffering as much as he was, both of them trapped in a cycle of trauma that seemed impossible to break. Maybe that was why they were drawn to each other, two survivors trying to make sense of the wreckage. The storm was getting stronger, the wind howled around them like a reminder of their surroundings, their chaos, but James refused to back down. "I will make you remember," he said more firmly this time, looking at Samson with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Even if the horse didn't recognize him now, James knew deep down their connection was still there. He just needed to find it before it was too late. The next morning brought a clear, cold sky, but the atmosphere at the ranch remained heavy. James had spent the night in one of the small cabins meant for temporary workers, but sleep never came. He lay on the hard bed staring at the wooden ceiling as flashes of the past overwhelmed his mind. The soldier screams, the thunder of explosions, and the sight of Samson running beside him through enemy fire. It all felt so distant yet so vividly alive. At dawn he headed to the pen. Samson was in the same spot, standing still like a statue, staring into the distance. The horse hadn't approached the fence. Not even when Jenny brought fresh food and water. It was as if he were trapped in a constant state of alertness, unable to relax. James noticed it immediately. He recognized that look because he had felt it too. "I know what you're feeling," James murmured, leaning against the fence. His voice was low but heavy with emotion. "That feeling that you're still there, that you'll never leave even though the place is long gone." He let out a short bitter laugh. "I didn't leave it behind, Samson, and it looks like you didn't either." Jenny, who had been watching from a distance while gathering the hay, finally approached. "You seem to know this horse well," she said, her voice soft but curious. James looked at her for a moment before responding. "He saved my life more than once." There was a weight to his words, something the young woman immediately noticed, but before she could ask more, James averted his gaze. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet. At least James knew he had to try something different. He stepped into the pen, his steps slow and deliberate. Samson perked up, his ears alert, but didn't move. James knelt down, bringing himself to the horse's eye level. "Do you remember?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The fields, the endless nights." He pulled something from his pocket, a small worn piece of leather, part of the equipment Samson had worn during the war. When Samson saw the object, his eyes briefly lit up, but only for a moment before returning to their usual emptiness. James felt a pang in his chest. Maybe Samson was trying to forget, just as he had tried unsuccessfully. The midday sun was shining brightly over the fence, but the heat didn't affect James or Samson. They stood there locked in a silent standoff. James held the piece of leather in his hand as if it were a key that could unlock buried memories, but Samson's gaze remained hard, unyielding. It was like staring at an impenetrable wall. Frustrated, James took a few steps back, running his hands through his messy hair. He could feel the weight of damage growing. He had thought this small object would be enough to break the barrier between them, but he realized that Samson's trauma ran deeper than he had imagined, maybe even deeper than his own. "I just need a sign, kid," James murmured, his voice heavy with exhaustion and pain. Jenny watched from afar, pretending to be busy with the ranch chores, but she couldn't take her eyes off the interaction. There was something about that silent connection that intrigued her deeply. Finally she gathered the courage to approach. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" she said, crossing her arms. "He has more scars than any other horse here. Maybe some things are irreparable." James stared at her, his eyes flashing with stubbornness. "Hune's not beyond repair," he replied, his voice firmer than he intended. "I've seen what he's capable of. I've seen the heart he has that doesn't just disappear." He took a step toward Samson again, but this time he didn't try to force anything. He simply stood there silently, allowing the horse to sense his presence. And then something happened. It wasn't grand nor dramatic, but for James it was enough. Samson slightly turned his head as if he were recognizing the man in front of him for the first time. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but James felt his heart race. It was the beginning of something, a small crack in the wall that separated him from his old companion. Samson's movement, almost small, imperceptible, was like a breath of hope in James's chest. He remained still, afraid that any sudden action might break this fragile moment. The silence around them seemed heavier, broken only by the soft sound of the wind rushing through the nearby trees. For the first time in years James felt like he wasn't alone in the invisible burden he carried. Samson tilted his ears slightly towards James, but his body was still tense. He didn't move forward, he didn't retreat, but this small gesture was more than James had expected after days of trying to reconnect. "You're still here, aren't you?" the boy asked James quietly, as if talking to an old friend. There was a tone of vulnerability in his voice he rarely allowed himself to show. Jenny watched the scene. She approached slowly, holding a bucket of water. She stopped a few feet away, careful not to interrupt the moment. "I've never seen him react like this," she said quietly. Maybe you really mean something to him." The doubt in her voice was clear, but there was also a hint of curiosity. Jenny didn't fully understand James's connection to this horse, but she was beginning to understand this was something far beyond the ordinary. James was beginning to understand that this was something far beyond the ordinary. He sighed, still looking at Samson. "He saved me when no one else could," he said, his voice heavy with pain. "Jenny hadn't expected to hear that we were in a valley, surrounded. I thought this was the end, but he didn't hesitate. He turned to face the fire, the smoke, and pulled me out of there." He paused, looking at the ground before continuing, "And I promised him I would never leave him behind, but that's exactly what I did." The confession hung in the air, heavy as lead. Samson turned his head again as if he heard something familiar in James's voice. The horse took one step forward, its hoof sinking into the soft earth. James couldn't help the shy smile that appeared on his face, a smile full of hope mixed with regret. He knew that this small step was only the beginning, but it was the beginning. The sound of hooves hitting the ground brought James a brief sense of Relief in his heart. Samson took another step towards him but then stopped as if something invisible still held his horse, its head down, its eyes frozen on the ground, and the moment of connection almost slipped away. James knew that forcing it would be pointless. Instead he dropped to his knees right there in the mud, trying to lower himself to the level of the animals like he did during training. You don't have to be afraid, the boy is out of business anymore, his voice said softly, heavy with emotion. The silence was broken by the sound in the distance, the roar of a helicopter crossing the sky. Samson froze, his ears darted forward, and the wild gleam that had disappeared from his eyes returned. For a moment James felt a change in the air, as if he had been transported back to the battlefield. He knew what was happening. Samson was reliving the sound of the helicopter was a trigger, a memory so vivid it seemed real. James remained motionless, watching Samson tremble, muscles tensing as he neighed louder than ever before. The horse began to circle the paddock, its tail lashing from side to side as if it was ready to run or fight. Jenny ran to the fence, her eyes widened. He was losing control. James did something, she screamed, but James raised his hand signaling her not to interfere. Samson, listen to me, James, he shouted. His voice was strong but full of urgency. He walked towards the center of the paddock, his arms were open in a calm gesture. Every step seemed risky but he did not hesitate. You are safe. Now it's over, boy, it's over. His tone was firm but not aggressive, and for a moment Samson stopped. The horse was breathing hard, his chest rose and fell rapidly as if the weight of memories was pressing on him to the breaking point. Then something changed. Samson raised his head and looked at James. His eyes seemed filled with something like a mixture of confusion and recognition. He took another step, then another, until he finally stopped in front of James. The man reached out trembling fingers and gently touched the horse's forehead. We are in this together, James whispered, and in that moment he realized that not only was he helping Samson heal, he was also facing his own ghost. Samson did not pull away from James's touch. It was a brief moment, but a meaningful moment when two survivors, marked by identical invisible scars, finally met. James froze, his hand rested on the horse's forehead, feeling the warmth and life pulsing beneath the scarred fur. Samson's breathing, once ragged, began to even out, though the fearful glint in his eyes had not yet completely faded. You remember me, don't you? James murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and pain, but he knew that the connection was not enough to erase the years of suffering they both carried. Samson was like a mirror, reflecting the traumas James had spent his life trying to bury, but now, looking at the horse, he knew he could no longer run. Jenny watched the scene with her heart pounding and took a few tentative steps towards the fence. I've never seen anything like it, she said almost in a whisper. How do you do it? He hardly lets anyone close, and now her voice wavered as she tried to find the right words to describe what she had seen. James didn't answer right away. He took his hand away from Samson and took a few steps back, giving the horse a chance to decide what to do. It's not magic, he finally said, not taking his eyes off Samson. It's pain. Pain connects us in ways humans don't understand. He knows I'm carrying something like him. Samson began to walk slowly around the paddock, but this time his movements were not frantic or panicked, although he was calm. Still vigilant, James watched each step, looking for signs that would tell him what to do. Then he noticed a slight shift in Samson's gait, a stiffness in his hind leg. The horse was limping and James frowned. He was injured, James said, turning to Jenny. This pain wasn't just emotional, he was carrying something in his body. Jenny nodded with a worried look. I'll call the vet, she said quickly, but James cut her off with a gesture. No, let me handle this. If he really knows me, then I'm the one he'll trust. Jenny hesitated, but something in James's expression convinced her. She nodded slightly before walking away again, leaving the two of them alone. James knew he was dealing with much more than physical injuries. Samson was a complex puzzle, a broken soul that would take time, patience, and most of all redemption. The man took a deep breath, preparing for the next step, fully aware that in order to heal the horse he would also need to face these parts of himself. James ran his hands over his temples, trying to organize his thoughts, watching as Samson struggled to walk across the paddock. The numbness in the horse's leg became more noticeable now that every step was an effort. James knew that physical pain, like mental pain, could be devastating, especially to an animal like Samson who had been trained to endure anything without hesitation, but no one, not even a warhorse, was invincible. He grabbed a bucket of clean water and a rag and walked slowly back to the paddock. Samson's ears had stopped twitching in alarm, but he did not retreat as he had before. It's all right, boy, James said in a quiet, soothing tone, kneeling down next to the horse. I won't hurt you. He gently ran the cloth over Samson's hind leg, looking for signs of injury as he touched a more sensitive spot. Samson yelped loudly and stepped aside, almost kicking James with his hoof. I know, I know, James muttered, pulling away just enough not to startle him. It hurts, but we have to fix this. He felt an unsettling similarity in Samson's reaction. There had been times during the war when James, too, had flinched at the touch of a doctor or a friend. The trauma had made even caring unbearable. Now he saw the same reflection in Samson, working carefully. James began to talk less to Samson and more to himself. To the emptiness around him. I should have come back for you, he said, his voice thick with guilt. I should have fought harder to get you out of that place, but I was broken, baby. I was just trying to survive. He stopped, swallowing hard as a painful memory filled his mind. They said you were gone, that they couldn't find you in the chaos. I believed them because it was easier than admitting that maybe I could have done more. Samson lowered his head slightly, his eyes shining, as if something in James's words made sense. This man stood up, taking a deep breath. But I'm already here, he continued, his voice gaining strength, and we're going to fix this. You've saved me so many times, Samson, now it's my turn to save you, gaining strength, and we're going to fix this. You've saved me so many times, Samson, now it's my turn to save you. After a few minutes James was able to examine Samson's hoof more closely. There was a small swelling, perhaps from an old injury that had never been treated properly. He knew it would take time and patience, but it was possible to heal. When he was finished he gently stroked the horse's neck. Samson didn't pull away. It was a small step this time, but to James it meant everything. The sunset painted the sky in warm tones as James watched Samson from outside the paddock. The horse was calmer, his movements were less hesitant, but there was still an emotional distance that seemed insurmountable. James could feel the weight of that barrier and knew it wouldn't be easy to overcome. He put one hand in his pocket, feeling for the small metal bell he had found among his old things. The item was a symbol of survival for both of them during difficult times, and he hoped that now it could be a symbol of reunion. Jenny, who was nearby, gathered herself. Hey, noticed the thoughtful expression on James's face and walked up to him. Are you okay? She asked, smiling shyly. He nodded slowly but did not take his eyes off Samson. It was strange that he answered, being so close to him and at the same time feeling like we were miles apart. Jenny placed her seven hand on James's shoulder, a silent expression of support. Why does he mean so much to you? She asked curiously but cautiously. James took a deep breath before answering, because he saved my life not once but several times and I promised I would never leave him behind. There was a heaviness in his voice that Jenny did not expect. She realized that the connection between them was deeper than anyone could have imagined. As they talked, Samson walked up to the fence, watching James with cautious curiosity. It was a small but significant movement. Jenny smiled, noting that she thought he was beginning to trust again. She said, trying to bring a little optimism to the conversation. James nodded, but his eyes betrayed that he knew there was still a long way to go. The next morning at dawn, James walked up to the fence with a bell in his hand, shaking it gently, making a metallic sound that echoed through the air. Samson looked up, his ears perking up. A familiar sound. He took a few slow steps towards James. His eyes shone with a mixture of recognition and caution. It was a brief moment, but it set James on fire again. I hope you remember that, aren't you a boy? James murmured, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. He knew that simple gesture meant more than it seemed. The sound of the bell was a reminder of days when the trust between them had been unshakable. Now it was a promise that they could rebuild it together. The silence of the old training ground was absolute except for the soft sound of the wind moving through the foliage. James remained still as Samson explored the grounds. Every step of the horse echoed like a distant reminder of the past. The yard where they had trained was unrecognizable, overgrown with vegetation and time, but something was in the air waiting for the collective memory that seemed to pulse between them. For Samson, this place stirred something long dormant. For James, this was his chance to finally find what he had been avoiding. James opened his jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal bell that he shook the object and the sound echoed throughout the air, like a familiar melody filled with history. Samson froze, his ears immediately perked up, his gaze fixed on the bell and hesitantly took a small step forward. You remember this, don't you? The boy, James whispered, feeling his throat tighten. The bell had been a symbol of the moments they trusted each other to survive. Now it was a reminder that they could still heal together. The horse came closer, almost touching James with its nose. It was a small gesture but full of meaning. James let the bell fall to the ground, its sound muffled by the earth. "I left you behind, Samson," he confessed. His voice was quiet and shaky. "I thought I was doing the right thing, that you would be safe without me, but the truth is I was afraid to face everything we had lost." He took a deep breath, feeling the words coming out with difficulty. "But now I'm here and we can send feedback." Side panels. History saved forward together. Samson looked up, his head, his gaze met James's as if in that moment something had broken the hidden barrier that separated them. Winnie's horse made a soft sound that James recognized as acceptance. He reached out and touched Samson's forehead, feeling a connection he thought he had lost forever. A deep sense of relief washed over him, and for the first time in years James felt like there was a way ahead. Jenny arrived soon after. Watching the scene from afar, she said nothing, just stood there with a calm smile on her face. She knew that something deep had changed, something that didn't need to be explained. James and Samson had found each other again, and in doing so they had also found a hope they had lost. As the sun began to set, James and Samson walked across the field together like in the old days. It wasn't just a walk, it was a symbol of a new beginning. The past couldn't be erased, but they had decided that they would no longer be its prisoner, and in that shared silence they had both found something more valuable than memory: the power to move forward. Block ads and earn rewards. Sponsored by Capital One's Hopping.com. Learn more